Rose, who's with us here, is a Greek Catholic and parishioner at St. Sophia's in Garner. She graduated with highest honors in her master's in international relations from the
Jagiellonian University
in Krakow, Poland. She has worked in real estate, media, diplomacy, and AI. Rose volunteers helping women in crisis pregnancies and has served the church as a catechist for the past 7 years. And where are you heading soon?
Oh, and
like next week?
Next week I'll be joining a monastery in Ohio, Christ the Bridegroom Monastery.
Yes.
So, yeah,
great for vacations. Great for vacations.
Oh, awesome. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for coming tonight. And also want to give a thanks to the Snickle editors and Mara for inviting me to come and present to you on, I would say, a special, rather unique topic, but also a relevant topic for every Catholic because we are the Catholic Church. We are the universal church. And universality does not mean uniformity in how we act or do things, but it does mean uniformity in certain ways. So I hope that this talk gives you some perspectives, some ways of understanding the church history, also the very messy parts of it, but also the beautiful parts of it. So we're the continual story, we're the resurrection people. There's always death and resurrection. So we have those themes playing out. And that's something I want to highlight here. So I broke the talk up into 3 parts so that we could have that focus. We're going to cover Motherland, which is the question of the origin. Where do Byzantine churches come from? How did they begin? Where did they start? Also, we want to talk about martyrdom. And the reason I chose martyrdom is as we go through the history, you'll see that reunification has always been a very difficult and persecuted action for churches that wanted to return to communion with the Roman bishop. So that's why I highlighted that here. And then mystery, to give you a brief overview of Byzantine Catholic theology. And there are a few terms you need to know, especially if you continue to read things in the future. That would be Greek Catholic, Byzantine Catholic, and Uniate. Now, I don't recommend using Uniate because that's actually considered a slur. So your Greek Catholic friends won't appreciate it if you call them that. But you will see these terms used, and they are all interchangeably used to refer to Byzantine Catholicism. And I also want to say that tonight, the topics that we're covering, any one of these slides could be a 3-hour lecture easily. So this is an overview, and it's an overview from my perspective. So I'm going to highlight what I think is important, but definitely there will be variations, and other people might have different opinions on some of these events. But I think that we'll get a good sense overall tonight. So when we talk about the universal church, what we need to understand is that the early church was broken up into 5 patriarchates. And those were Rome, Constantinople, Antioch, Alexandria, and Jerusalem. These were the main bishops. They were all considered directly appointed by the apostles. Like, these were places the apostles set up bishoprics. And what the unity of the church was twofold. It was unity of faith and jurisdiction. And this matters because faith meant they all had one belief, and jurisdiction meant they all agreed on the authority in the church to a certain extent. So the bishop in Jerusalem didn't tell the bishop in Antioch what to do. And this maintained relative peace within the church because they had these 2 things in common. They were agreeing upon how the church was going to act in day to day and also agreeing upon what the faith was. And it's also important to understand that the Bishop of Rome always had a very important role. You can read early church writings. They talk about the bishop in Rome and how he has this special role because Rome was established by Peter and Paul. And that bishop has a responsibility to care for the unity of the brethren. However, it's again important to note that we can't take our current day and age where you can pick up a phone and theoretically you could call the Pope today, or you could call the Patriarch of Constantinople today. It's that easy to have access. We are way back 2,000 years ago. It took months for anyone to talk to anyone. So everyone, for the most part, was kind of operating on their own. And the only time that you ever were elevating things to a higher bishop, to the Patriarch, to the Bishop of Rome, was if something was really, really bad and you couldn't come to resolutions on your own. So this is important to understand because we all know that there's a very important emperor named Constantine who comes into play, and he does not make Christianity the religion of the empire. That's a later emperor, but he does make it legal. But he also does something very important. He decides that he's going to take the Roman Empire's operating center out of Italy, and he's going to bring it to a city known as Byzantium, that he then changes to name after himself, Constantinople. So he takes the operating center and he moves it. And this is important to understand because when the bishops that were over in Constantinople had the emperor living with them, they said, we have the Christian emperor here now. It's not like in the past when the emperor was in Rome. So we really think that the kind of, maybe the big honcho bishop should be us. And this creates a lot of tension because the bishops in Rome go, whoa, 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 wait. We got our authority because this is the way Christ wanted us to be. The highest in honor among all the bishops. Like, we are the top bishop because of our establishment of Christ, not because it was where the Roman emperor was. And this creates a lot of tensions that sometimes things boil over, they go up and down, but that is really where you see this focal point change between the relationship, because remember, united in faith and jurisdiction. Faith has not come into conflict. Constantinople and Rome aren't preaching different faith, but jurisdiction now is getting a little, tensions are rising about that jurisdiction question. And this is a very important person to know, because his name was Photius. And while there were some maybe minor schisms that happened before he came along, Photius really blows things out of the water. Now, in the past, the political leaders had a lot more say in who was bishop. And it's important to keep in mind that the patriarchs are the highest level of a bishop. So patriarchs have bishops under them, but the patriarch, in many ways, he kind of functions like the Pope does for the Roman Church, but in the individual other churches, they would call their Pope essentially like the patriarch. And when the Byzantine Emperor Michael III, he had a patriarch, but he didn't really like Patriarch Ignatius, because Patriarch Ignatius, he was trying to stop people that were destroying icons. They didn't want images venerated, but they had already ruled on that in the council and said we're going to venerate images. And a lot of the royalty and ruling class there, the nobility, they were still iconoclasts. And he not only is upset about that, but Ignatius denies communion to his uncle when he finds out that his uncle committed incest. So clearly he's not well liked, and he pushes him out, and he appoints his own man named Photius. He has a synod elect him, so it looks official, but Photius isn't even a deacon, a priest, a bishop. He's just a layman, and he's the person that the emperor wants, though. And Pope is over in Rome, Pope Nicholas, and he hears that there's a new bishop in Constantinople. He's like, oh, did Ignatius die? No, he didn't die. So he sends his legates over there to figure out what's going on. And when the legates arrived, because this was tradition as well, when there was new patriarchs appointed, all the other patriarchs would send their representatives to go acknowledge the new person. They go to Constantinople, and they're like, man, this is a dumpster fire of what's going on over here. And they aren't very keen about it. They return to the Pope. He hears about what happens, and they not only tell him about the mess that occurred between the emperor changing the patriarchs forcefully, but that the current patriarch told them that the Pope has no authority in Constantinople, and he has no say in approving who is or is not the patriarch in Constantinople. So Nicholas won't recognize Photius. He continues to recognize Ignatius as the proper patriarch. And nothing really happens, though, right? Everyone's living apart. Nothing happens. But the king of Bulgaria gets conquered by the emperor. And the emperor, as part of their deal, says that you have to make your nation Christian. Again, complicated history, so we can't dive into that too much. But this is actually pretty common practice. When the emperor would take over a new territory, he would let them know, okay, now the new religion is going to be Christianity. But the Bulgarian king, he's not really just going to take this lying down. So he sends a message to the Pope and says, hey, I'd rather that my church was run by the Latins, not by these Greeks over here in Constantinople. And the Pope is more than happy to oblige, and he sends his men over there, which really upsets Photius, because he says, hey, you're violating my jurisdiction. This is my territory. I'm in charge of this land, not you. And your people are coming in here, and they're using unleavened bread. Their priests don't marry. You're telling them that they need to do things the Latin way, not the way we do it in Byzantium. And this huge fight erupts. And Photius is really important because Photius is really the first person who writes against the filioque, which is, if you recite the Creed on Sunday at your Roman church, you say, Holy Spirit who proceeds from the Father and the Son. Filioque is that and the Son part. And the East was aware of the filioque, and some people had questions about it, but you had people like Maximus the Confessor, who actually wrote and defended the Latin saying the filioque, saying this isn't a problem. I still like our formulation better, but there's a compatible way to think about this. But Photius, again, remember, he was a layman. he weaponizes this difference he sees, and these Latin missionaries are coming and teaching what he considers heresy. He goes to the other patriarchs who also have some beef with the Pope, thinking that the Pope thinks he knows everything. He thinks he can rule everything, and we don't like that. And so they decide to excommunicate not only the Pope, but the whole Western Church. And remember, this is not what when people call the Great Schism, which 1054, which is not really accurate. This is back in 863, 867 that this occurs. So this is some of the early troubles that brews. Now, Ignatius does, because Emperor Michael III is killed by a rival to the throne, and he puts Ignatius back in charge for a period of time, because again, this is a lot of political power play going on. But once Ignatius dies, then there is a legitimate ascension of Photius to being the patriarch. And the Pope tells him, hey man, let's come to an agreement. So do you think that they came to an agreement about the heresies of the West? No. They just came to an agreement about how to take care of Bulgaria. And then they lifted all the excommunications on each other and moved on from that whole episode. So again, it's one of those things to highlight a lot of the political tensions that were happening. And they kind of come to the agreement that the Latins will run the churches, but the Byzantines will still kind of be in charge. So again, they don't seek a resolution about the supposed heresies they condemned the Western Church for. They're just really working a lot on the political level and about their power and who has jurisdiction where. Now, this is what most of us are somewhat familiar with, is what occurs around 1054. So in 1053, Patriarch Michael closes all the Latin churches in Constantinople. And he's got some beef with things. Now, he cites things like unleavened bread. Okay, so it's really important to keep in mind the things that people talk about, filioque and all these other things, these were not really considered a very big deal. Major things were considered in liturgical celebration differences. So the unleavened bread thing was a really big issue for him. Pope hears about it. He's like, oh no, I'm going to go tell that patriarch he can't close my churches. And he also says, we're going to go defend our theology, and you're also going to tell the patriarch, stop calling himself the ecumenical patriarch. Ecumenical is, think of it almost as a synonym for the word Catholic. So ecumenical here means universal, the whole. And that's the instructions he has, because now the patriarch over there is calling himself the ecumenical patriarch. He's in some ways claiming that he actually has those rights over the universal church. And while the legates are on their way, the Pope actually dies, so the legates lose all their authority to do anything. Naturally, when the legates show up, the patriarch's not really thrilled that they're there, so he tells them, I'm not going to cooperate with talking to y'all. I make my decisions about what churches are going to be here and not. Legates respond by excommunicating him, although keep in mind, they had no authority because the Pope that had commissioned them had died. And the patriarch responds by excommunicating the 3 legates who came. And here's where it gets even more complicated, is this isn't technically a schism. Technically, you just have one person excommunicated and 3 people excommunicated. But from this point onwards, the churches cease to commemorate the bishops in their liturgy. So there's no, because if we think earlier to when the Oriental Orthodox broke off with the church, there was an ecumenical council held. And at the ecumenical council, they said, this is what we believe, accept it, or you're no longer part of the church. This is not what happened between Rome and the East. There's no real legitimate schism here that's been done the proper channels. This is a lot of feelings, a lot of pettiness, and people just excommunicating each other. But there's no actual condemnation of the other churches going on. So things also begin violent. You'll hear of the Greeks massacring the Latins massacring the Greeks. The Latins try to appoint bishops to replace the Greek bishops, and it just really turns into a mess from here. Now, this is a real turning point we have to reflect on, though, is, okay, what happens next? And some of us may know that a religion popped up in the East in the 600s that grew very quickly. And that religion is Islam. So, and there's an ecumenical council, Loynes II, 1274, but there's no lasting changes at this Second Council of Loynes. There's no big changes that happen. They agree on paper they're going to reunite. Nothing happens at all. But the emperor gets a little antsy when the Ottomans are knocking on the door of Constantinople. And he's like, guys, we're not going to win this battle alone. So we're going to go back and we're going to talk with the Western Christians before we get annihilated out here. And the Council of Florence is called 1428 to 1445. And the council is accepted by all the Eastern bishops present, except for one fellow named Mark of Ephesus. And the ecumenical council, though, technically met both the East and West requirements, because in the West, a council, again, it had to be, and in the East as well, you had to have the bishops come together from various places. The West said the Pope needs to accept, and the Eastern definition was you need to have the Emperor accept, because they're still very tied into the state power. So this council is accepted by both the Pope, the Emperor, and the presiding bishops almost unanimously accept this council. And please keep in mind that, like, again, when you think about the issues at this council, anyone want to take a guess what kind of issues they discussed? There's 5 main topics. What?
Political.
Actually, not political in this case. Like, they wanted to reunite for political purposes, but like, what 5 theological issues do you think they discussed?
Filioque.
Filioque was one. That was, again, kind of a smaller one, but it was one. Okay. So, first things, communion bread. We're using leavened bread and you're using unleavened bread, so we're going to talk about it. Another thing was purgatory, papal power, filioque, and the epiclesis, which is where the priest calls the Holy Spirit on the gifts at the divine liturgy or the Mass. So these were actually the main topics being discussed at this council for theological reasons. And the opposition, though, to the council, again, keep in mind, the Byzantine Empire, very weak. Lots of dogs chomping at the bit. Not just the Turks coming in, but the emperor himself has a lot of men that see him as weak, and they want to be in charge. So they decide they're going to prop up clergy that don't want to accept the council in the hopes that they'll get rid of the emperor because he supports the council. So people like Mark of Ephesus, they get a lot of boost from these people who want the council to not happen. And Constantinople did end up falling, as we know, to the Turks. They couldn't achieve a union within the church. The council didn't get implemented. And then the Western nations, they never regularized relations with them because they didn't see a purpose. They didn't see them actually, quote unquote, fix their Christianity. So they left them to the Turks. And when they come in, they're smart. The last thing that they want is for a crusade to happen because the Eastern Christians reunite with the Western Christians and the Western Christians come in to save them. So they are now in charge as the new political power of who's going to be the bishops. And they didn't want bishops that were going to end Christianity, be like, oh, you have to all become Muslim. No, they just chose bishops that were totally against Florence. If you were against Florence and you did not want the churches reuniting, you could be a bishop. And so this is what really killed the whole Council of Florence becoming successful. A lot of people talk about like Mark of Ephesus, and he's an important character, but you need to understand that the main reason the Council of Florence failed, because it does meet ecumenical requirements, which I am able to go over in detail, it met the requirements, but it got rejected because, well, all the bishops that got in place immediately afterwards were anti-union. And this is actually a picture of the patriarch meeting Mohammed the Conqueror, who came in. So just like with the emperor, he would meet with him, discuss issues with the church. The Muslims totally took that place and really impacted things. This is a bit of a side note, but it also really destroyed a lot of like the Eastern schools of theology. So you'll hear people say that in the East, we don't ask deep questions and we are just la 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 la. Well, that's not true. What happened was all their theological schools got closed when their area was totally dominated. Like they weren't allowed to have these open discussions anymore. So that's not like quote unquote the Eastern way to never think about things. Like all the early ecumenical councils happened in the East. So again, side note, but yes, the East does theology, but their theology schools got closed. And it was actually the Roman Catholic Church, the Pope, who set up schools right outside the border that priests and bishops used to go to get educated in, and then they would return back to the Orthodox Church. So, and they didn't make them become Catholics to go to these schools either, but just like a fun fact. So now this comes about, well, so okay, how do Byzantine churches tie into all of this? Well, not every Byzantine church is stuck over there under the rule of the Ottomans. In fact, one of the biggest voices at the Council of Florence was the Patriarch, we're calling Metropolitan of Kiev. He was really in support of reuniting with the Catholic Church, all on board. But I'm this might be wrong, but I think his name was Isidore. When he gets back to Kiev, what happens is there's this group there called the Muscovites. And They later on formed the Moscow Patriarchate, but they're a big, powerful voice right now there, and they do not want to reunite. So they actually chase Isidore back to Italy, and they refuse to implement the Council of Florence. But overall, there's a lot more willingness within this region of what we call the Rus people. Again, this is not Russian people, this is the Rus people. It's sort of this area in like modern day Ukraine, part of Slovakia, part of Hungary, a little bit into Poland. This whole region is very pro actually reuniting with the church. And it comes under the domain of the Polish-Lithuanian Empire. And when this happens, the bishops, they don't want to be Latinized. They don't want to be made to convert all their churches into Roman churches. So they send a message to the Pope and they say, we would like to, like we were willing to back at Florence. You remember us guys, right? We're the good guys. We actually do want to be part of the Catholic Church. So can we maintain all of our traditions, all of our liturgies? And the Pope is more than happy. He goes, absolutely. You know, Pope Clement, he just is all on board with this idea and he brings them in. But the Eastern Orthodox do hear about what's going on over there and they do not like it. So what's the response? Well, the Patriarch in Jerusalem goes and ordains all new bishops to replace any bishop that decided he wanted to be in communion with Rome. Now, if you remember, we've been talking a lot about jurisdiction. We're talking a lot about authority. Does the Patriarch of Jerusalem have the jurisdiction or authority to go replace the Patriarch in Kiev? No. All right, if you answer that question, no, you got it right. So something important to keep in mind here is that the Ukrainian Catholic Church, Byzantine Catholic Church, we're all part of this group. Belarusian Catholic churches as well. We are the legitimate, actually, line from the Byzantine Church in this area. The Ukrainian Catholic Church is the legitimate line actually going forward. If we look at this from a jurisdictional perspective, our bishops willingly chose to go back into union with Rome. And then another patriarch did not like it and decided to come in and co-opt it. And he would ordain basically anyone who was willing to put up a fight against reuniting with Rome. So he went through and ordained men without permission in someone else's jurisdiction. So major issue here. And of course, this also resulted in religious violence, right? People get riled up, angry. One of the people who was killed was Blessed Josaphat. So he's a pretty popular martyr in the Byzantine Catholic Church for this reason. He was killed by an angry mob that was riled up by people who were like, these evil men are stealing our churches. And there was violence. So I don't want to give people a misperception. There was violence both ways. Okay. But it was predominantly against Byzantine Catholics who, whenever the political situation changed, generally speaking, fell under a lot of persecution. So like the Ukrainian Catholic Church here in Raleigh, Byzantine Catholic Church, they're both the result of this union. Next, we have the Church of Antioch. And if you've all read the book of Acts, you know that Antioch, very ancient church, important patriarchate in the history of the church, one of the 5 original patriarchates. And Antioch is always kind of in a bad situation. They were one of the first places to fall under Muslim rule. And then the Byzantine Empire comes in. And while they're their saviors, the Byzantine Empire decides, the Byzantine Church is like, we don't really like the liturgical rites of Antioch, so you're going to adopt the Byzantine rites now. So the original liturgy of the Antiochian Church is technically actually sort of gone. It's been replaced by the rites that originated in Constantinople. So they were forcibly, you could say, Byzantinized then. And the church in Antioch never, though, really fully left communion in Rome. They're just kind of always stuck, right? So either the Muslims were controlling the area or the Greeks were controlling the area through Constantinople, and they just kind of were floating out in outer space. Now, you remember, Catholic Church in 1500s has to deal with this great change in the church, the Reformation. And at the Council of Trent, there's a big decision that we're going to try to reunite churches and redouble our evangelistic efforts. So Jesuits and Franciscans go to the Holy Land. And when they go over there, they meet their friends over in Antioch. And they build hospitals, schools. They actually build a lot of really good relationships with the Antiochian church. And Antioch is like, all right, you know what? We never even officially broke communion with you guys. Again, 1054, what church got condemned for committing heresy? Nobody. There's no real schism. And they're like, so we're going to make it official. And Patriarch Cyril V, he just says, all right, I'm coming back in communion with the Catholic Church. And it's going to make it official. And in 1724, though, there's another Patriarch, Cyril VI, who's elected. And he's really big into keeping communion with Rome, staying united. But the patriarch over in Constantinople, he hears about how much goodwill is going now towards the Pope, and he doesn't like that. So what does he do? He says, I'm not going to respect the decision of the local church to elect Cyril VI. I'm going to appoint a bishop to be the new patriarch. I'm going to choose somebody. And he finds a nephew of a previous patriarch in Antioch, who's currently a deacon, and he elevates him to being a rival patriarch in Antioch. But the people, remember, the people chose Cyril. The clergy chose Cyril. He was elected there in the local synod. So they don't really like the fact that the patriarch in Constantinople just violated Antioch's jurisdiction, and they don't want to accept his new patriarch. But Constantinople has the power of the Ottoman government to enforce their decision. So without really any hesitation, Jeremiah III, who's the rival to the patriarchate, asked the Ottomans to brutally suppress anyone who's going to follow Cyril instead of him, and has Cyril essentially exiled. Now what this becomes is Cyril were called the Milkites. So that's the Milkite Catholic Church that you've heard of, possibly. It's one of our larger churches. And Sylvester were called the Antiochian Orthodox, if you followed with Sylvester. I'm sorry, Jeremiah. Oh, yeah, no. Yeah. Oh, no, sorry. I apologize. Jeremiah was the patriarch over in Constantinople who came in and made Sylvester the patriarch there. So with all of this in mind, again, what's our united in faith and jurisdiction? So here's the next question. Did Jeremiah III actually have the authority to appoint a rival patriarch when he didn't like the decision of the local church to appoint Cyril as patriarch? So what does that make the Milkite Catholic Church but the legitimate church following the canons of the church? And this is important to recognize because you're going to meet people, especially online, that don't really know what they're talking about when it comes to Byzantine Catholic churches. And they'll say things like, oh, Byzantine Catholic churches are just a bunch of Latin priests who decided to switch out their vestments and do a different liturgy. No, we are legitimate churches that came in with our bishops into community with the church. So this is not just the Roman church decided that they want to come after the Eastern Orthodox and they sent their Latin priests to just switch out their vestments and pretend to be Eastern Rite. No. We are legitimate churches. We are, in fact, especially in these two cases, for Kiev and Antioch, the legitimate decisions of those churches to come into communion with Rome, that other patriarchs didn't respect the jurisdiction of those local churches. So that's just something really important to keep in mind. And even today, martyrdom is not done. So Milkite Catholics, like most Christians in Syria, face almost extinction at this point. They've been persecuted nonstop, and there's very few Milkites left. There's almost as many Milkites that are out of Syria as there are in Syria. And in the USSR, the Soviet Union didn't like Greek Catholics because the popes at the time very vocal about the evils of communism. You should go back and read all those papal encyclicals that came out about communism. So the Greek Catholics, when they would arrest the Greek Catholics, they would charge them with being secret agents of foreign states that were there to subvert the government. And the Greek Catholics around 1950 basically got a choice, 1949. Become Russian Orthodox or we'll destroy you. Many Greek Catholics chose to say that we believe in the unity of the church and we won't allow you to force us to reject communion with the universal church. And about, month-ish ago, I was actually over in Central Europe. And so these are pictures that I took of the relics of 3 bishops who were martyred. We have Blessed Basil Hopko, Blessed Theodore Romsha, Blessed Pavel Peter Gojik. And they were all martyred by the Soviets because they refused to become Orthodox. They were given opportunities. They'd even imprison them. They say, listen, we'll let you out. You just got to say that you're no longer with the Catholic Church and become Orthodox. And they all chose to remain there. In the current conflict in Ukraine, if you are living in a Russian-occupied territory of Ukraine, it is illegal to be a Greek Catholic. You are not allowed to hold services. So many priests were arrested. Some they detained for 2-3 years. No one even knew where they were. And then they randomly kick them to the street and we find them. So to this day, the Byzantine churches are very heavily persecuted. And I think it's important to note that the Russian Orthodox Church was initially persecuted by the Soviets. And then they realized that persecuting all religions was a bad idea. So they said that you can work with us some of the Russian Orthodox chose to cooperate with the government because, again, in Orthodox ecclesiology, there's a real tie into the state government still, like this, because they don't have any other really unifying factor necessarily, hate to say it, but it's kind of like in a very practical sense, a unifying factor for like day-to-day operations. They heavily rely upon governments. But you did have many Russian Orthodox who also said no. And they were exiled out of Russia as well. So I want to clarify, basically the people who got left in the Russian Orthodox Church were weak men and also KGB agents. Like the current Patriarch Kirill, he used to be a KGB agent before he became clergy. It's actually a very well-known fact. So, yeah. But this is just a slide that I have here that shows you the churches that came in to communion with the Catholic Church. I only highlighted Ukrainian and Melkite. Naturally, there's 13, so there's a lot of them. I can't tell every single one of their stories, but I'll give you a brief overview. Now, to talk a bit about our theology and what makes us unique, and I want to emphasize that you can find any of this technically in any tradition. But these are things that I see, at least at present, that are very popular. One of which is epiphatic theology, and that focuses on the unknowability of God. So we talk about what God is not. Like, God is not simply a being among beings, right? God is not partially human, partially divine. So we use a lot of negative theology when we talk. It's like a form of respect and also looks at like the unknowability of God. So we don't like to make a lot of what we call cataphatic statements, which is like scholasticism was very much into that. Like, let's talk about who God is. Like, we talk a lot about who God is not in our theology. And you also find because of that, there's a lot of hesitancy around ideas like development of doctrine, because that's where you kind of take reason, you go to like its next logical step. For better or for worse, you don't find that way of thinking a lot going on in Eastern theology for that reason. If we try to focus on what we know and what that means about what we don't know versus like trying to like make theology become this progression that keeps going on. It's also very incarnational. So this is an image actually of during our Lenten liturgy, the pre-sanctified, where there's a lot of prostrations, kneeling, and bowing. We actively incorporate images into our liturgy. So it was funny because at one point when the other week I was down in Mexico at Guadalupe and we had a divine liturgy, and the poor deacon, because there's parts of the liturgy where you're supposed to bow to an icon of Christ and bow to an icon of Mary, and there's no icons of Christ and icons of Mary necessarily in a Roman church. So he had to like kind of like figure it out. Like he'd find like the closest picture of like Our Lady of Guadalupe and, you know, kind of like give it a little reverence because, but in our liturgies, like it's written in like how to interact with the images in the church. So we also have a lot of focusing points of bodily posture and even breathing when we pray, like kind of inviting that connection of your soul and body to work together, and ascetic practices. So what in general our fasts, like we kind of are like, okay, everyone, if you can be vegan for all of Lent and all of Advent, that's great. And now you kind of like whittle it down though to like based upon your level. So ascetic practices are encouraged, not just like if you're a monk or a priest or a nun, but it's really encouraged for all the lay to participate in. And if we're focused also on the Theotokos and her role in salvation, like there's a lot of conversation. I was watching the other day this Protestant, he was so funny because he was talking about Cyril, like one of the great doctors of the church, and he says, you know, he had such great Christology, but his Mariology was so awful. And I was like, he really missed the boat on that because the Christology was informed by the Mariology, but it's a very big deal. I also want to talk about divine liturgy. What does it mean for us, like when we're looking at the divine liturgy, what are we seeing? And some of this is a little different maybe from things that you've heard in the Roman liturgy. So the bishop would be understood to represent God the Father. The priest would be looked at as the apostles, and the deacon is Jesus Christ. If you've attended a Byzantine liturgy, you'll notice that the deacon throughout the liturgy is coming in and out. So he goes into the Holy of Holies and he comes back out to the people, into the Holy of Holies, back out to the people. So he's like Jesus coming between the two worlds throughout the liturgy, like actually like coming into our reality to the Father, and our reality back to the Father. So Jesus has this like movement going on throughout the whole liturgy. And the liturgy sanctifies time and place, the economy of salvation. And this is also why we have to have incense, because our incense symbolizes creation, and you can have a liturgy without creation. Highlights. I know I'm running a little late, but okay. So highlights, structure of the narrative. We have 12 petitions of the Great Litany that start off our liturgy, because that's for the minor prophets that prophesy the Holy Spirit coming. We have the prayers of the Mother of God, because it's coming to show the end of the prophets and the coming of Christ. We have that shift in our conversation. We have the Hymn of the Incarnation at liturgy. Now, again, if you've never attended one, this might not make a lot of sense, but if you have, then you'll know what's going on. So the birth of the Messiah that we sing. The royal doors are closed as we sing this song because the world doesn't know the Messiah is born. And those are the doors we have at the front, in front of the altars at our church. And the litany has 3 petitions, which show the presentation in the temple, flight to Egypt, finding in the temple, a gospel procession that shows Jesus coming out to preach among the people, a thrice holy hymn, which is our holy, holy, mighty one, holy God, holy immortal one that we sing, that is telling us that the ministry is going to the Transfiguration, now on to Jerusalem. And of course, the Eucharist, Calvary, I think we all can make that connection very easily. But when the royal doors are opened and the Eucharist is brought out, that shows Christ coming out of the tomb. So again, just kind of like little details. If you attend, you kind of get a picture of. And of course, for us, salvation is primarily understood as a union that occurs with God. So our ultimate purpose is what we call theosis, which is where just like God became man, man becomes God, not in the sense that like we literally are going to be like, oh, from eternity we always exist, but no, we share in that divine life that is occurring. And salvation, that process, God not only heals our human nature, but he's going to restore it to something better than we had before because Christ's divinity and humanity have touched. And so God's going to actually give us a share in who he is. So it's not just a simple like he fixes broken humans, but he actually fixes us in a way that elevates us in a way that we previously could not have been before. Of course, we know Theotokos, living temple of Christ, carrying him in her womb. So we want to be that same incarnation as we go out. And thank you so much. I have a couple things to pass around, like really nice icons and things. So if anyone has a question, comment, concern, grinding and gnashing of teeth, stones to throw, now's your opportunity. But these are just some icons that people can also look at.
Be careful, she's bringing these with her to the monastery.
Yeah, so these are all like genuine icons. There are rules for how icons are supposed to be drawn, actually. There's very specific rules about the art. So here, if I can just take that for half a second. Let me give you an example. So for the Theotokos, you'll see these stars. There's also a star on her left shoulder. 3 for the Trinity, and also to symbolize her virginity before, during, and after the birth of Christ. Oh. So she has these stars. So like often if you reverence an icon of Mary, you can like kiss the star on her shoulder. Mm-hmm. We don't generally kiss the faces because you just kiss the face of Jesus. But that is an example of like, when I say it's an icon, it's following the rules of how icons are supposed to be made. Icons also are supposed to include the identifiers of who they are. So like this tells us that this is Mary in this image. So, yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong, Rose, but didn't iconography heavily influence art up until like the Renaissance period?
I mean, so iconography was influenced by the Byzantine style of art in Constantinople. And I would say it still influences people, right? Like we still see people looking at these images and really like reflecting on them. I also have some books here. So this is the Divine Liturgy. And then this is like a breviary. Now the Byzantine liturgy is ridiculously like huge. So it fits into like more like 12 books. But if you're someone who doesn't want to have like 12 to 20 books, you can use a book like this to like have your Vespers and Orthros, Matins, and all those things. So yeah.
2 forms of the liturgy.
Well, we have 3.
Well, 3.
No, but like the liturgy is more than just the Divine Liturgy. Mm-hmm. So, okay, any questions, comments?
I have to read this whole thing before I pass it, right?
Yes, definitely. Yeah, any questions about the presentation? Should see before. Oh, yes.
What's the best way to get icons? Or the books? Or both?
Okay, so so for icons, it's really 2 ways, right? If you want a hand-painted icon, those are very expensive, and you kind of go on wait lists and you contact an iconographer. And I know a few of them, and that's how you get them. But if you are more willing to look out and kind of get icons that are more printed, then a good place to look, for instance, would be like Legacy Icons. I think that's the name, right?
They're an American-based Orthodox company. They have some really good quality.
Yeah, so like you like go to Legacy Icons, you can find some nice icons there. And then for books, the liturgy books are generally sold by what are called eparchies. So if you look like at an eparchy store, you can probably find one. The Hours book that I have was produced by the Ukrainians. There's a place called EC Pubs, or Eastern Christian Publications, and they sell the liturgy books for a pretty decent price, if that's something you're looking at.
Now keep in mind there's going to be slight differences in the wording for each individual rite.
Yeah, there's no like one translation like there is for the Roman, right? So everyone has their own translation of the liturgy and the hours. So, but yeah, cool. But yeah, and then the other thing for you all to have, these are modern day martyrs actually of the Ukrainian Catholic Church. So this is Blessed Olympia Beta. She was a nun, and when it became illegal to be a Greek Catholic and they arrested all the priests, she continued to hold religious services in secret. She eventually got found out and was arrested, but she sent her, even in the prison, she continued to hold services. And something I didn't mention is a lot of the bishops, the way that they died is they would go to the hospital and then they would poison them. Like they would pretend that they died of their illnesses. So a similar thing happened to her. She got sick supposedly in prison, but she probably got killed by the doctors there. And then you have your Blessed Roman. He was a parish priest, and this is a picture of his family because we have married priests in the Byzantine Rite. This is a picture actually of him with his family. He was also told he needed to become Orthodox refused, and they locked him in a room, and we don't really know what happened. We don't know if he starved to death or they beat him to death because the guards told two different stories of what ended up happening to him. But so these are holy cards. You can take them of some modern day martyrs of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. But, excellent. Oh, yes.
So given like the common historical tradition that Greek Catholics are coming out of, how has their view of that relationship with state power changed? Because it just seems like state power is so thoroughly integrated in the East historically, and arguably with a lot of positive effects at certain points and then a lot of negative effects going on.
Right.
Greek Catholics have suffered very acutely in regards to that. Has that affected that theological view at all?
I think it has played a really big part in it because, again, there's no territory right now, and there hasn't been, honestly, for like centuries, where there's a Greek Catholic ruler. So I think that this is a way that it's been healthy in the development of the theology to be united to Rome, because they no longer have that same idea of the importance of using the political ruler as the means of maintaining unity in your church. Like that idea, for the most part, it's now we still maintain a very strong conception of like collegiality and the importance of the local bishop, but there isn't really that reference anymore to state power because, again, there hasn't been a local state government essentially for them for a very long time. So that idea is almost entirely gone now from the ecclesiology. It's very focused on the bishops. And they're actually having this tension right now in the Eastern Orthodox Church because with the Enlightenment, for the most part, left them untouched until like the last century. And in the last century, a lot of bastions of orthodoxy and a lot of their governments went completely atheist. And so they're having to have that question sort of come up among themselves now, which is what do we actually do? Because this idea of reverting back to having Christian princes and Christian kings and Christian rulers isn't a sustainable ecclesiology, at least in the modern world. And that creates a lot of tension among like questions, okay, like how does the church and the state play in with each other? And so they're almost facing questions the Catholic Church faced like a long time ago. And that's in part why Vatican I also happened, because there were people in Europe, like when the Catholic basically rulers fell, there were that questions like who's really in charge. And so part of Vatican I was addressing secular rulers that actually didn't want control of the church, not just like papal power. But, yeah.
Do you happen to know what that
Yeah,
is?
this is like a quote from the Psalm about Christ, the Good Shepherd. So that's a quote from the Psalm about the Good Shepherd.
You're not sure what psalm it is?
No, it's the Good Shepherd Psalm. Like, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want.
Oh.
He leads me beside.
I forgot what that was.
Yes, no worries. So, yeah,
That's
that's,
beautiful.
I like it.
You see it?
But, and traditionally icons have real gold in the background, so that's why they're actually that shiny. So, it's not fake, it's real. But, awesome.
And also, you'll find if you go to some of the older Byzantine churches that the
Okay.
entire church
That's
from floor
good.
to ceiling is covered in iconography. There's like no white space if you go to a proper Byzantine church.
Well, it takes time.
It takes time and a lot
All
of
right. Oh, you need this too. Okay. Okay. So if no one else has a question, then I think we're probably good to wrap it up. But really appreciate it. I'm sorry I went a little over, but I hope you got some new knowledge. And definitely, there's 2 Byzantine churches in the area. If you haven't yet visited, definitely think about it. So there's Saint Cyril Methodius in Cary, and they're a Ruthenian church. And that kind of also came from Kiev, so that whole region there. That Ruthenian church is part of that church. And then there's St. Sophia's in Garner, which is the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. They offer one of their liturgies in English and one in Ukrainian. You're definitely welcome to visit. You can receive communion. It fulfills your Sunday obligation. And yeah, thank you so much. Appreciate it, everyone.